The movie opens up with best friends, Baggy and Joe, at a funeral doing a video shoot. They were very rowdy and insensitive while they worked, and Baggy got punched in the face. The next day they meet up on their way to class, and Baggy is still visibly upset about the punch, but Joe finds a way to cheer him up. Joe and Baggy are final-year film students at Leatherhead University. They dream of becoming big-time movie producers, and doing video shoots for funerals and other gigs was their way of making money and getting experience while in school. Joe is a very optimistic person who always looks at the bright side of life and tries to get things done no matter the obstacle. A goal-getter. In contrast, Baggy is just the opposite of that. In class, they learn from their Professor Dolberg, to their chagrin, that their final year project, which they'd been working on for 3 years and was more than 90 minutes long, was supposed to be a short film. Not more than 2 minutes long. The boys were very sad and disappointed by this. There was no way that they could edit a 90-minute movie into 2 minutes. And even though they could create a new project, they had spent a lot of time and effort on their feature film, and they didn't just want to abandon it. At home that night, after telling his parents what had happened in school, Joe's parents expressed to him that they weren't really on board with his dreams of becoming a movie producer. His dad owned a driving institute, and he and his mom wanted him to work with them as a family business. But he didn't want that. He hated the idea. The next day, Joe and Baggy go to a restaurant and they meet their mutual friend Lila. After venting to her about their feature film, she inspires them to go to London to pitch their movie to some of the big movie studios. And Joe quickly buys the idea. Although Baggy wasn't very sure about it, he and Baggy get in his car and they drive to London. In London, they go to a few movie studios and they get rejected. Baggy was already feeling discouraged, but Joe was just getting started. As they are walking, they see another movie studio, and they go inside to pitch their script. While they were at it, Joe soon started to realize that it wasn't just a regular movie studio, but an adult movie studio. And the person in charge, a man known as Doug, wasn't impressed that their pitch didn't have any mention of things of an erotic nature. And he tells them that the only way he would consider funding their movie was if they made their movie more pornographic. And they starred Candy Five Ways as their lead female. This was almost impossible because Candy Five Ways was the creme de la creme of the adult movie world. On their way home, Baggy was feeling discouraged, but Joe was excited. He saw it as an opportunity to get funding for their movie. And even though they'd never met Candy Five Ways before, or even knew how to get a hold of her, he was excited. At home, they got some adult movies to brainstorm and research with, and while they were watching them, Joe's parents came home to catch them in the act. And let's just say that they weren't very impressed. The next day, Joe goes to look for Candy Five Ways. He goes to a distribution company to get her number, and he charms the receptionist into giving him the closest thing to the number she had, what they thought to be her manager's number. He calls the number, and he talks to the person on the other end. And for 250 British pounds, they scheduled a meeting for him with Candy Five Ways. He was very excited. He quickly goes to the movie studio and tells Doug that he's got Candy Five Ways. And after a bit of skepticism from Doug, they signed a contract. During the contract, Joe learns that Candy Five Ways had worked with Doug before and that they'd parted ways on unfriendly terms. He asked Joe to keep the company's involvement a secret from Candy Five Ways and everyone else. And so as not to lose their funding, Joe agrees. The next day, they go to some sound and lighting guys in their school to ask them to be part of their crew. At first, the guys refuse, but on hearing of the nature of the film, they gladly agree. They go around town posting ads for casts, and then they find a space in their school, and they do the casting there. At the end of the casting, while they're waiting for Candy Five Ways to show up, Joe gets a package delivered to him, and on opening it, he finds that it's a blow-up doll of Candy Five Ways. The Candy Five Ways that he thought he was getting was nothing but a blow-up sex doll, a terrible one at that. Even though Lila and Baggy are a bit discouraged by this, Joe's not, and he manages to share a bit of optimism with them. Doug goes to see Mr. Michael DeVere. Michael DeVere is Doug's boss and the owner of the company funding the movie. He asks Doug about the movie and Candy Five Ways, and Doug tries to convince him that Candy Five Ways was happily working with them and that the movie was going smoothly. And then Michael DeVere tells Doug that Candy Five Ways was actually on a break, promoting a new book that she'd written. Doug was shocked and embarrassed to hear this, He thinks that Joe and Baggy are making a fool out of him, and so he and Robbie angrily go to Joe's school. At the school, they introduce themselves to Professor Dolberg as Joe's dad and brother, and they bully Joe's address off of him. Then they go to Joe's house, and they meet Joe's parents there. Doug introduced himself to Joe's dad as Professor Dolberg. Joe's dad tells him that Joe isn't home, but he and Robbie rudely let themselves into the house to wait for Joe. Later that night, when Joe arrives, he finds Doug and Robbie in the living room with his parents. Doug gets Joe's parents out of the living room, and while alone with Joe, he threatens to kill him if he is lying about casting Candy Five Ways in the movie. Joe's parents come into the living room, and Doug and Robbie leave. Joe and Baggy find out about Candy Five Ways book signing, and they go there to meet her. When they see her, Baggy is immediately entranced, and he goes up to her. Lila shows up, and Joe confides in her about the problem he is having with Doug, and he asks her to keep it a secret. Meanwhile, Baggy manages to sweep Candy Five Ways off her feet, and before he leaves her to continue with her book signing, he gives her the manuscript of the film with his contact information in it, and he asks her to read it, and she agrees. Baggy goes back to his friends to tell them the good news, and they are all excited. A couple of nights later, while they were already getting discouraged, thinking that she wasn't going to call them, she called them and agreed to star in the movie, and they are over the moon. The next day, after Joe's parents leave for work, Lila shows up with the rest of the cast and crew, and she tells Joe that they are gonna have to use his house as the primary location for the movie. This came as a surprise to Joe, but being that they were trying to cut costs, he had no choice but to agree. A few moments later, Baggy starts to freak out. He felt like his story wasn't good enough, and he asked to speak with Joe. But just then, Candy Five Ways shows up, and they are all blown away. Joe tries to put up this fake professional demeanor with her, and Baggy just freaks out the more, and he runs upstairs with Lila following to calm him. Joe introduces Candy Five Ways to the cast and crew, and that doesn't exactly go very smoothly. From the microphone, they could hear Baggy and Lila having a seemingly weird conversation, and Joe ran upstairs to switch off the microphone and to comfort him. He didn't want them to give Candy Five Ways the impression that they were amateurs. But Candy comes into the room and makes them understand that she knew everything about them and how inexperienced they were, but that she still wanted to work on the movie with them because she thought it was a great script. She asks Joe and Lila to leave, and she speaks with Baggy alone. And somehow she makes him feel like a rock star. Soon they start shooting. Even though things didn't exactly go over smoothly because of their unprofessional behavior and having to work around Joe's parents' time, they managed to make it work. They also shot the 2-minute short film for their professor. While doing that, Doug calls Joe and threatens to kill him if he doesn't deliver the movie in a week. A couple of days later, while shooting, Joe's parents unexpectedly show up. Everyone scampered out through the back door, but Joe and Vlad were trapped in his parents' bathroom, and his parents had just come home to have sex. Joe starts to freak out, and he and Vlad take off their clothes to tie a rope so that they can climb out the window. Joe gives one end of the rope to Vlad and throws the other end down the window, but Vlad has already dropped his end to spy on Joe's parents having sex, and the whole rope goes down the window, so they were stuck in the bathroom, both 87% naked. After waiting for hours at night while Joe's parents were still at it, Vlad had to go number 2, and when he did it, he forgot not to flush the toilet, and he did. Joe's mother came into the bathroom, and she was mortified. A couple of nights later, when they are done with shooting the movie and out at a bar, celebrating its success, Doug shows up to collect the movie tape. And while he was at it, he taunts and makes fun of Candy Five Ways for working on a movie that he'd financed. His movie. Candy was flabbergasted by this. She felt betrayed by Joe and Baggy. Baggy was angry too. Everyone was angry at Joe. They all felt like he'd tricked them into working for a thug. Baggy gives Doug the movie, and he storms off angrily. At the premiere of the short films by the final year film students, Baggy shows up and tells Joe that he'd switched the films. He'd given Doug their 2-minute short film, and what they and the hundreds of teachers and students were about to watch was the porn film. Doug, on the other hand, was with Michael DeVere watching the movie, and Michael DeVere was pissed and disappointed. Instead of the full 90-plus minutes movie of Candy Five Ways, They had the 2-minute video that Joe and Baggy had recorded for their school project. Doug and Robbie drive angrily to the university to meet Joe and Baggy. And on getting there, they see that they were premiering the movie on the big screen in their school, and even though they were pissed, they were impressed. Joe's parents are furious, and Joe runs out of the hall. Outside the hall, he runs into Doug and his professor, Mr. Dahlberg. His dad also came out, and it was a bit of a confusion trying to sort out who was who. Doug takes the movie from Joe and he leaves. Joe's dad was furious, and Mr. Dahlberg was too. Mr. Dahlberg tells him to forget about getting his diploma and not to come to school anymore. He and Baggy. Mr. DeVere was finally happy, and Doug was happy too. They expected to win some awards with the movie. Joe goes to see Baggy. Despite all the commotion, he wasn't giving up. He was excited that they'd made a movie, and he wanted them to start work on another movie, but Baggy didn't want any of it. A couple of weeks later, while going through some adult magazines, the sound and technical guys found that their movie was nominated for the biggest award in the adult movie industry, and they were excited. They all rushed to Joe's father's business place to look for Joe, and being that they don't speak a lot of English, it is hard for them to explain to Joe's dad. Joe comes inside and he sees that their movie was being nominated for a Golden Cockerel, and the award ceremony was that night. But his name and Baggy's name had been scrapped out of the project, and they weren't getting any recognition for their work. On seeing this, even though Joe's dad wasn't a big fan of the whole porn industry or his son working in it, he couldn't let the fact that he was being cheated of his award, so he gives Joe the key to one of his cars and asks him to go to London to claim what was rightfully his. Joe calls Lila and asks for her help. The technical guys also go to Baggy's house to convince him to come with them to the award ceremony, but he refuses. At the award ceremony that night, Lila joins Joe, and Joe is just blown away by her beauty. The technical guys show up and they tell Joe that Baggy had refused to come with them. Joe sees Candy Five Ways on the red carpet, and he goes up to her to apologize and to tell her that he'd lied to Baggy too, and that Baggy had no idea about his involvement with Doug and Mr. DeVere. But she didn't care, and she wanted nothing to do with either of them. Meanwhile, in Leatherhead, Baggy learns from his friend at the movie shop that everyone loves the movie, and this motivates him to go to London for the award ceremony. At the award ceremony, Candy Five Ways was called on stage to present the awards, and she saw that Joe and Baggy's film, their film, was the winner of the Golden Cockerel. But Joe and Baggy's name had been replaced with Doug and Michael DeVere's. Just as she calls out the winner of the award, she sees Baggy lurking behind the curtains backstage, and instead of calling out Doug Perry and Michael DeVere as the producer and director of the movie, she calls Joe Clark and John Baggy instead. As the real producer and director of the movie, Joe happily goes on stage to receive the award, and he also sees Baggy and calls him out on stage with him. They both receive the award, and Baggy kisses Candy Five Ways, and Joe kisses Lila. They both went on to make proper films and actualize their dreams. So, that'd do it for now. Till next time. Stay real.